Well, hello guys, and welcome back to my channel. So today I would quickly like to talk to you about some like a quite very important topic that pertains to software development, and that has to do with security. So when you are starting out with software development and trying to get your hands into get your hands dirty, trying to understand how things work, it's totally okay more or less to almost do whatever it is. There are more or less no rules applied, so to say, because in the beginning the whole idea would be for you to actually understand how things work. So you could probably make a lot of mistakes as it pertains to security, because your main focus then would be really to understand like how the code works itself. So but over time, when you of course when you start working with in a much bigger team for enterprise organizations, building like really large huge applications for enterprise applications, then it becomes quite prevalent. And it's could also come as a lot of challenge for a lot of people. It also was for me, to be honest, because I had to go from building applications for say startups and smaller maybe in-house products that could be used to do certain tasks in-house, to building enterprise application that could interface between several organizations. And sometimes, to be honest, these organizations could have maybe like really big organizations that could have thousands of employers and be making say billions of euros in revenue per year. So for these organizations, it is really like they don't joke about it at all. It doesn't, for them actually, it doesn't even matter how good the product is. It's much more valuable to them if that product is secure, to especially depending on what standards each of these organizations have. So it becomes quite imperative that it becomes a really huge topic regarding software development. And of course, for most people, this only pertains to, let's say, when you're setting up the architecture and designing how things should look like and everything. But of course, trust me, it's much more than that. It's actually boils down to what the developers themselves are doing. But what I would want to do today, more or less, is to kind of like give you an or bring it to your attention some of the things that could happen or could go wrong, and what I also from my experience and also what I've seen some like really smart developers do to try to secure the application that they are building. This is more or less what I will try to show you today, and hopefully this would be useful to you more or less. So I would like to, I'm going to maybe list, so I can say approaches. And I'll try to make this a little bigger so you can of course see what I'm doing. Maybe I can even make it 24, doesn't matter. I think this should be okay. And so what I would want to do more or less is to oh, I can't write markdown here, that's also fine. So but what I will try to do is to tell you or show you more or less some of the things to watch out for, and then we can go into details a little bit on each of these individual topics, you know. So the first thing, of course, that I always consider would be the overall architecture of the software that we are building. So this would be the first thing. And of course, we're going to go into details for each of them. So don't worry about this. Actually, I might make this a little bit smaller, maybe 14, I don't know. And I hope, yeah, you can still see it. So that's totally fine. So apart from architecture, so the next thing, of course, I would try to call it maybe coding practices. Maybe I'll put a hyphen in front. Coding practices. And the next thing might be deployment. I'm just going to call this deployment, and then we'll get into details, of course. The next thing, of course, would probably be maybe I'll call this continuous, let's say, improvement and compliance, something like this. And of course, as a bonus, I'm just going to add one here called general practices, or maybe some like general best. best practices. So these are some of the points I would like to more or less talk to you about. We will expand on each of them, of course, and just to give you an idea of what I would do or what I do actually to secure my path, my the projects I'm working on. Like of course, following some of the principles that I will group under these 5 topics. So we're going to take them one after the other, and actually, I would like to put this at the end because for me, this is actually the most important topic. So I'll leave it to towards the end. That will be the last we'll talk about. So to get started under under coding practices, I think maybe I will actually move maybe write this as maybe markdown. I'm not sure if that's okay. But or maybe I can also maybe put some drawings. Actually, it doesn't really matter. So I can maybe put some drawings here, and then copy all of this in here to make it a lot more interesting. I'm just gonna reorganize this, and then we can continue with our discussion. So I have actually reorganized what we wrote initially. I think this is much more cleaner, and also I think it's also much more nicer to look at. But like we were saying, I think I would like to talk to you a little bit on these 5 topics, and maybe also give you some ideas, some input from my own side as to what I've learned over the years and what I also see other experienced developers do, and also some of the things we do together when we have to collaborate in a much bigger team. So this is not just coming from me, but also from what I've learned from other experienced developers do over the years. So the first thing, like I said, we'll talk about would be coding practices. So under this, I'm probably just gonna add a new tile over here, and then maybe I list some points in here. So the first thing that's I always consider under this topic would be I call this input validation and sanitization. So of course, this has to do with making sure that you invalidate every form of user inputs that you have to get from your application. Doesn't really matter what. Maybe a user has to do something at some point while they use your application, and to do that, they have to maybe provide some inputs. All inputs that your user provides to your application have and should be validated. Like, do not assume that the user would provide exactly what you would expect them to. If you expect the user to provide an email, do not trust that the user will actually go ahead and provide an email. Always validate whatever it is that the user tries to give you. That's really the point here. The next point would be I would call this I can call this authentication and authorization. If you do not understand the difference between these two, authentication and authorization, I think the application you are building is already flawed. So the point here is to make sure that you always use secure authentication with your application. So if you're managing the users yourselves by which, let's say, you would have to maybe provide the users with some tokens, and then you have to validate these tokens. Or maybe you are also using like third party applications, or if you're using the cloud, for example, let's say AWS, and you're using, say, Cognito to manage your users, or maybe you're using Azure Cloud and then you're using Entra ID to manage your users. The tokens will always or should always be provided. That a user has successfully logged in should not be enough for whatever it is, for whatever request that comes to your application. That request must always be validated. So even after the user has logged in, that request must or should still be validated. um, of course, when it pertains to authorization, of course, this makes a lot more sense, because that the user is authenticated does not mean that the user is authorized to access certain resource in your application. So that's so. Just to make this clear, if a user is can successfully log into your app by fulfilling all the criteria, let's say they have to do some user password login, basic authentication, or maybe some or maybe they have to do some SSO or whatever it is. When this is successful, the user has been successfully authenticated into your application. But it might happen that the user is some regular user and the user tries to access some admin pages, for example. They will not be authorized to access those, even though they are authenticated. That's just the difference. So this is really, really helpful to, of course, manage permissions in your application. This is a really, really important point. And of course, I did a video in the past where I talked about hierarchical role-based access control. This also is really, really important, and is can be easier to manage or difficult to manage depending on how you've set up your application. Of course, if you have designed your application in a really, really nice fashion where it's pretty much modular, and then you have like this tree view of everything in your application, it makes it actually a lot more easier to manage these permissions. But I also already have a video that I did in the past where I talked about a little bit how you could do this. I will also leave the link in the description so you can check it out on your own at your own pace. Um, yeah. The next point I would like to touch up. I'm gonna get rid of this. Next point I would like to touch up would be encryption. I'll just simply call this encryption. And so for this, I don't think it requires so much talk here, because trust me, these are really huge topics themselves. But I'm just bringing this to your notice so that you know, if you have to work on an enterprise application, these are some of the topics that will always come up. So one simple example would be encryption at rest and in transit, like let's say HTTPS over HTTP, and of course TLS, and the rest. So the whole this is like a really, really huge topic, but of course always the point is pay attention to encryption. Do not, for example, have to expose an endpoint that is not secure. Like this is really, really wrong. And of course, if you have to build an application where you have one of your customers is another company that have their own IT team, and this will already tell wrongly and badly on your expertise, because they would start to question if you really know what you're doing. So this is really, really one good point that you should always pay attention to. And of course, maybe the last thing I would just add here, this would more or less might not really be so much falling under the development team, but of course, maybe if you have like a cybersecurity team, but I would call this say I can call this security audits and pen testing. So this pertains more or less to if you have like a cybersecurity team, that would of course help to make sure that it would not be possible to hack into your application. So they would be able to do some penetration tests to your application, and then of course do some form of audits to let you know what's possible security vulnerabilities might be there in your application. And so these are some of the points that I consider under coding practices. And I'm going to structure this a little bit, and then we can start talking about deployments. So pertaining to deployments, the topics I would like to touch up here, they would not be much, but of course they are also equally important. So the first thing I would like to look at here would be, I can maybe just call this secure deployment practices. So mostly if you're working on an enterprise application, please do not make the mistake of suggesting to have the code repository on a public platform. This is already like a red flag that this should not even be an option at all. So always, of course, go for the repository should never be a public one. If you are building an enterprise application, do not make that mistake. And of course, to automate deployment processes, always make sure that your deployments are actually done using a pipeline. Please avoid making manual deployments. This can, trust me, cause a lot of errors and a lot of problems along the line that would really, really be difficult to solve. So again, do not use public repos, and of course automate all your deployments using a pipeline. That's really, really important. The next point that I also find quite important and interesting here would be I can call this robust monitoring and logging. So this is really, really important for scenarios. Of course, this is also really quite useful if you work in a big team, because again, this is really difficult for one person to manage. It is really a lot of work, and please don't even make the mistake of saying that, oh, I should be able to do this. Please do not do that unless you don't want to be burnt out in a couple of weeks or months. But normally, if you have like a big team, this should be something you should not overlook. This is really, really important, and this should, of course, go not just, of course, this is really important from the point you're considering deploying the code to, let's say, tests and everything, and then to the actual deployments. This should always, of course, best practices to enable and configure monitoring and logging, so that you have more like a bird eye view of the entire process, and you can always tell where problems come from and when. And this, of course, makes it a lot easier to mitigate these problems as soon as possible. This is really, really important. And of course, another point, which more or less also is a little bit quite similar to the one above, but of course quite different in its own way, would be I can call this maybe incident response. So this is also quite a very, very interesting and a useful point. But again, this, just like the previous one, is only advisable really if you work in a big team. And of course, I'm just going to go ahead and assume that one person will not be able to, of course, develop an enterprise application. But that's really the point here. But this is one point. So the point is, if you work in a big team and let's say you're just starting out, and then you realize that the guys are actually not talking about this, please, you should speak up, let them know on why this is actually quite important. And of course, trust me, they will listen to you, because this is really, really important. you know and so these are some of the few points I would like to talk about under deployments. They're actually pretty straightforward, but even though they are pretty straightforward, I think they also require a lot of work. So that's also why I think this is something that's should be undertaken, or should be taken care of in a slightly bigger team. So it requires a lot of manpowers, and that's also why it's really important to be implemented when you have a lot of hands on deck. So that's one thing I can say from my experience so far. So under continuous improvement and compliance, this actually contains um, a lot of topics that's also not pertains not just the development team, but also maybe the business units, because under these topics, you have to consider things like industry standards and regulations, say things like GDPR, for example, if you're in Europe or so, and the HIPAA and the rest. So it's also really, really important, because of course this pertains to, like I said, not just during the development phase, not just the development team, but of course also the business team. Because if you're in Europe, there are certain user data that you are allowed to store, and for a certain period of time. So if you work with if you're building an enterprise application whereby you have to deal with a lot of these big companies, this is something you really, really have to pay attention to. Because if your application is, let's say, an application where users can um, anonymously go and make a vote, for example, you do not need to collect the user's email if that's the case. Just things like this. So the point here is to, of course, pay attention to some of these regulations. Do not collect user data that you do not need. And when you do, of course, store those data in compliance to the regulations within the host region where you are. Of course, that you are unaware of some of these regulations does not mean that when you default, you would not be charged to court and then maybe receive like a really huge fine from for defaulting, more or less. So this is really something that's always, of course, comes up all the time. So for that, the first point I'm just going to put here would be maybe I can call this maybe compliance. And as an example, I'm going to add, say, GDPR. Did I spell that right? Okay. And then I can also add, come on, HIPAA, etc. So this is really really important. Of course, if you the point of this video is to bring your attention to this. If you do not know about it, that's also totally fine. But of course, ask the right questions, ask the right persons the right questions to make sure that you don't build an application that in the end, even though it's such a nice and shiny application, it gets rejected simply because you did not know about these laws. And of course, making having to modify your application to certify some of these laws would again require you to go back and spend, let's say, additional 1 or 2 months to modify something you've already sweated out and maybe completed. So this can also really be annoying. So it pays a lot to have this at the back of your mind before you get started, and then you can always know to fix these issues and of course have conversations around these topics when they come up. Very, very important, guys. And maybe as a bonus, I'm just going to add another one here, and I can simply say something like industry best practices, something like this. And of course, this is a little bit similar to this, but maybe not completely. So under this topic, you would need to consider things like, so most what I've also realized also is that with certain organizations, they follow certain security practices. And so if you are tasked with developing such application, always pay attention. Maybe there is already a standard within the company or organization, or maybe there is already a standard when they work with external companies or vendors or whatever the case may be. Always pay attention to this. If you, for example, have to, let's say for me, for example, I develop a lot of IoT solutions, and sometimes I have to, when of course when I'm done developing these solutions, they need to be within the customer environment. Of course, they would need to run within the customer network. And so one thing that I have also from my own experience is that if at least for my own person, when I have these IoT applications developed, and they run on the customer on premise, and they have to run via the customer network, maybe into the internet, it becomes actually paramount most times for most organizations that there has to be some form of security checks on least on some such devices, for example, having like antiviruses or stuff like that. And of course, because they would always have the argument like it doesn't really matter. That's, of course, we trust you, you develop this application for us, we'll be working together and everything. But again, there's always that question: if you have provided us a solution that have to live within our network and then accesses the internet via our own network, what happens when that piece of software, for example, gets corrupted? Let's say there is some Trojan virus that happens to maybe affect this piece of software that you have written, which is now within our network. Is there any form of guarantee you could give that a vendor or a company or whatever or organization to say, okay, this something like this should never happen? Of course, you don't have control over that. If it's out there on the internet, if it has permissions, of course, access the internet, it might also happen that there might be cases whereby you're having virus attacks and all that. So, and of course, you cannot really give them some form of guarantee to say that would never happen. You don't know that it could happen. So in most cases, of course, this is something that most people, of course, do not pay attention to. But if there should be some form of vulnerability via the application that you already have living within their own network, it might also happen that it might also affect some of their own applications living within the same network. So this is something from my own experience also that most people don't really talk about, but this is really, really, really very important. Always take note of this. So, guys, under general best practices, I have a few points here I would like to talk about. The first one would be principle of least privilege. I hope I spelled privilege correctly. Oh, I think I didn't. Is there no D here? I think there's no D actually. Sorry, guys. Um, so I'm not sure if you are already familiar with the principle of least privilege, but just to keep it simple, this simply means do not give your users, for example, the permissions they do not need. So give your users the least amount of permission they need to be able to do their work. If you have an application, for example, where you have a user and whose only task is to, let's say, log in into the tool, write some tickets, and then close the tool. That's the only thing a certain user has to do with your application. That user has no business having the permission to go to, let's say, your to look at your accounts, to look at user accounts, user emails, and stuff like that. So it's really, really important that if you're designing the software, you always, of course, design certain level of permissions that certain users can have in your application. Define a permission for a certain user whose task would be only to view tickets or write tickets, for example, so that if it happens that there is such a user in the end, let's say Tony is the user, and all I need to do in your application would be to log in, create a ticket, and then log out. Assign me that permission so that the least the permission that has the least amount of privilege that I need to do my task. So that if I should log in that tool and try to go to look at user accounts and look at their emails, for example, I should be denied access. I should not have permissions to do what I don't need to do in the tool. This is really, really important. Um, and under this for now, I would maybe just add one more bonus point here, and I can say maybe up to date best practices. So this is also quite important. So if you always, of course, one principle that I always work with is that I do not always rely on what I know at any point, to be honest, because I believe that we live in a really fast paced world and things constantly change. So it's actually quite important that I always stay up to date with the best industrial practices as it pertains to security. So if I think it's no longer sufficient to build an application whereby you manage user permissions by just them having some user and some password and then they log in and then that's it. I think we are actually way beyond that. If you work for big corporations, and then you would also realize that this is quite a huge topic. You would now understand how to manage permissions to, let's say, not just on the user perspective, but also on the resources within your application. Topics like role-based access control will become important for you. Hierarchical role-based access control lists will become important to you. Access control lists, basically any of these current ways to implement permissions and roles and attach and assign those roles to users and resources that you already, of course, see being implemented in cloud solutions, say Azure or Google Cloud or AWS as well. These are some of the current best practices that are being employed to manage user permissions and roles. So always, I would say, try to stay up to date with some of these best practices and, of course, implement them in your solution. As much as fast, of course, as you can, and don't shy away from always trying to learn new things. That's always for me something I know I do all the time, and I will also, of course, encourage you to still do the same. Now, the last and, of course, the important point also I want to talk to you about would be architecture. So architecture should security as it pertains to architecture should not be a feature. From my experience, it should actually be part of your software design. That's just one thing I could say, and I'm going to elaborate on that. So, from my experience, what I've also noticed working with some developers and across different teams is that I've realized that for most, I don't know what the statistics would is looking like, anyways, but I can tell you that for some developers, security is more or less a feature. And I think that's really, really wrong and a really, really bad way to design the software, because personally, I believe that security should not be a feature of the application you're designing. It should be like a very, very integral aspect of the application you're designing. It should not be an afterthought. It should not be something like a cherry on top of the icing that you have to consider after you've completed the development and design and development of your software. It should be considered throughout the entire phase of the software, from the development, from the planning phase, to design phase, the architectural development and design phase, to the actual development. I think security should always cut across these all topics and should not be an afterthought. And I can tell you a few things that I think or I do more or less when it comes to implementing security in my application. And I will also maybe show you some architectural drawings, and then we can wrap this up. So the first point I would really want to tell you here would be actually pretty straightforward one, and I can call this modular design. So if you've ever, if you've ever, let's say, tried to, or if you understand, or if you've ever had to work with, or had to write, say, Terraform plugin, for example, that's the first example that came to my mind right now. You would understand that the concept that HashiCorp has with Terraform plugins is actually really, really interesting one. I really love it, where you actually write your different components of your or more or less these plugins as they're as modular as they come, and what it means is that they're like sockets. You can actually pluck this one out and put in another one, and then it should still fit completely. So it's really, really nice. It's a really, I don't think I've also seen like a lot of applications where this is nicely implemented, and I really love it. And I think this is something that I always, of course, do all the time. If time would permit me, I would maybe in the future talk a little bit about modular design of softwares, and then of course I would like to share my thoughts with you, what I've learned over the years and what I have seen people do, and then maybe also get your own inputs. So, but just have it in mind that modular design actually really, really, really helps. Because it's make it a lot easier to manage your application. It makes it a lot easier to actually pinpoint which aspects of your application have security vulnerabilities, and then also makes it a lot easier to actually mitigate them as quickly as possible. This is really, 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 really important. The next point here that I also find actually that I love so much would be, I would call this multi-layer. So I can actually say that I do not design new softwares anymore if they're not going to be multi-layered or multi-tiered. And what I mean is this: I like to, if for example I would of course show you an example using a simple architectural drawing, just to like a quick overview, and then we can wrap this all up. Yes, but what I mean here is I'll always like to have, let's say, a data tier. So if I have like like 2 3 databases in the whole application, I like to have like a completely tier, whereby I manage everything that regards to data stores or whatever would be managed on this tier. So you have like let's say an authentication tier, more or less, where everything regarding authentication, authorization, or whatever actually is being managed. So this is also from my experience actually why it helps. It also goes in the same direction as the first one. And because if you expand this to, let's say, if you're using a cloud solution, and then you decide to, for example, use a virtual network to deploy your application, then you could actually liken these layers and tiers as you could actually have this separated into, let's say, subnet within your virtual network. If there is, for any reason, for example, a compromise, it can only happen within a tier. Like if at all it happens, it's pretty difficult for it to propagate all through the tiers of your application. It gets stopped wherever it was ever able to get into in the first place. I always don't joke with this anymore. This is actually how I go for now. And of course, maybe the last point I would want to put here is I can just call this my come on, go away, microservice. I think this is also, to be honest, quite overrated. Not that I'm completely, I'm of course very much a fan, but I think most times people actually abuse the whole point of working with microservices. But nonetheless, I use microservices, of course, as much as possible, but of course only when I feel that it's actually needed. Again, it also goes in the same direction as the first 2 points, because you have this logical separation of the different components of an application, so that if for any reason there is a breach or whatever happens, it only affects a certain aspect of your application. It's not easy, it's not quickly, it's actually quite difficult to propagate through the like different components of an application. While in contrast, if you have like a single monolith and it gets compromised, of course, everything is compromised because you have everything living within the same box, more or less. But of course, this helps to mitigate this. And yeah, these are some of the points I like to cover, and I like to, of course, always consider each time I'm building a new or designing a new software. So this is something I think, or I thought I could share with you. And yeah, of course, feel free to, of course, tell me what you think. I want to hear what your points are, if you agree, if you disagree, if there are other approaches you take in your own design. I just want to hear what you have to say, and then, of course, maybe questions you might have, and then we can discuss this a little bit. And so, like I said, to buttress a little bit on this multi-layer, multi-tier setup, I might decide to go with assume, let's say we are building a new application called App Tony, some app somewhere. I don't know. I don't even know what this app does, but the name of this app is App Tony. And then I decided to, when we in the design phase, I decided to, of course, have agreed to use the Azure cloud, for example. I've agreed to deploy this to the Azure cloud, and not just to deploy to the Azure cloud, I've also decided to use a virtual network. Okay, so imagine, for example, this is my Azure subscription. So I decided to, within my Azure subscription, I decided to create in here a subnet, sorry, a virtual network. So this will be my virtual network, of course, within my Azure subscription. And within my Azure virtual network, I decided to create, let's say, a couple of subnets. For example, I can make this, I'm just going to label this also to make it a lot easier for you to get what we are doing. And so we have, let's say we have 4 subnets, for example, and I'm going to label this, guys. I can call this VNet. So this will be my virtual network. I can make it bolder so you can see it. So this is my VNet, and maybe I can, can I add some style? Nope, I don't want to write this. I should be able to get some help on the side to help me style this. Come on. Um, okay, I'm gonna edit this afterwards, but follow me here. So this is I'm just gonna add one here. Come, go away. I'll copy this. So this would be again, I need to label this. I can call this Azure subscription. So this is my Azure subscription. And I have this VNet, and inside this VNet, I decided to create subnets. So I can call this subnet 1. I'll copy this and then duplicate it 4 times, of course. Name this, of course, subnet 2. Go away. And I'll call this subnet 3. And I have maybe this last one down here, and I call this subnet 4. So imagine this is the setup I have. for example. And then let's say, of course, our application has a front end, a back end, or whatever. And then so for the, I decided, let's say what I can do, of course, would be I might design my application in such a way that, of course, I have a back end. And of course, maybe I'll tell you this right away before we continue. That's in what I mostly do, not maybe like 99% of the time, is you only have access to the application I provide via the front end. So what it means is that I mostly, let's say 99% of the time, never allow the front end to access the resources in let's say in my virtual network or in the cloud or whatever. The requests, all such requests must go through the backend or whatever. So the point is that I don't allow direct access from the front end to say my database. That never happens. That mostly never happens. I would say like 99% of the time. So what I could do is, let's say in the subnet 3, I could have maybe I make this a smaller one. I could have a CDN. So it's like going to my content delivery network, and I could have let's say my API. So in the context of Asia, for example, this could be my API management service. And the point would be, maybe I want to have an API management service that would allow me, or would connect to some Azure functions that would again do certain tasks for me. And what I can now do more or less is to put those resources in here, let's say in subnet 3. So here I'll have my CDN, for example. I'll make this a little bit bigger. I have my CDN here, and I'll have my API. And of course, security wise, maybe what I can also do is to maybe I can search for something here, and I can say firewall. And so what I can do, of course, maybe is to put a firewall here, for example. And so that's every incoming request, for example. So if we have a client here, I can add a client. Let's say we have a client down here, and this would be some user trying to use our application. So if this user tries to access our application, it goes to the firewall. Did that actually get to where I want it to go? So it first goes to, okay, actually that it first goes to the firewall, and then the firewall, from the firewall it now goes to the CDN, and then it can also go from the firewall maybe to our API. So the point is this: when you access our application, this subnet will only, as regarding security, we only allow requests that are coming in from, that have passed, of course, some of the rules we've set up in our firewall, and then only then can they have access to our CDN. The CDN here and the API. So what we can now do, of course, is maybe back here we can provide, let's say I have a server. Let's say I have my backend server, for example, here. Let's say I could have my backend server here, and I have my front end server. So what it means is, if you try to access, if you try to log in, for example, you would, maybe I also separated this way, of course. So this will be my backend, this will be my front end. So what it means is that this subnet will only allow inbound request from this subnet 3, because now we can use, let's say our CDN, for example, can now talk to our front end, for example. So what it means is that if a user tries to access our front end directly, we would of course block that request. We will only honor it if the request comes from the API get from our firewall, and then firewall will go through some setups we'll have here. Maybe we'll have some API get to application gateway or whatever, or NAT gateway, and then goes to our CDN, and then our front end we only accept requests from a CDN within subnet 3. So what it means is that if we even have another CDN in subnet 4, subnet 1 will not honor that request, because it did not originate from a CDN within subnet 3. This is getting more complicated, I know, because now we are getting into network um, topics. But the point again, like I said, is that you can think of our subnets in this sense as the different tiers in our application, like we talked about up here, having a modular multi-layer setup. And then maybe down here we can actually now have our Azure functions. I need to find the maybe I can't Azure function, for example. And now maybe in here we have our Azure functions, and then let's say we have, I don't know, two of them. And now these two Azure functions, we only honor requests that originate from this API service um, that is within subnet 3. And what it means is, of course, if there is any other API in our application that is in any subnet that is not within subnet 3, it will reject that request. I don't want to get into too deep detail in here, but the point I'm trying to make is that if, for example, our subnet 3 gets compromised, it doesn't affect these other layers of our application. It doesn't affect subnet 4, subnet 2, or subnet 1, or as the case may be. And then it's, of course, makes it a lot easier to pinpoint what the error is, where that error has happened, and then try to mitigate that problem in time. So that's really the point here, not to confuse you with some of this network jargons, as the case may be. So that's more or less what I wanted to show you. I think this is a really, really, really quite important topic that most people sometimes actually overlook, but I think it's actually important, because again, if you work on enterprise applications and you work with a lot of also with experienced guys from like bigger teams from big companies, and they would always look out for these topics because they are really, really important. Anyways, guys, that's actually what I wanted to share with you today. I hope this was useful at all to you in some way, and maybe also was a little bit also insightful. Yeah, like I said again, if you, of course, please feel free to leave some comments. Let me know if you agree, if you disagree, if you have other experiences, if you would like to, of course, go ahead and start a conversation with me. I would always love to hear what you have to say. Um, but that's all. That will be all for now, guys. That's all I wanted to share with you today. And yeah, guys, go ahead, of course, and subscribe if you are new to our channel, and of course, like and share our videos, and do so, of course, encourage us to go ahead and make you more interesting content. Anyways, that will be all, guys, for now. And until next time, have a lovely evening, and bye bye, guys. Bye.